The light over Los Angeles broke through the haze like a blade of gold cutting across glass, refracting against the windows of Forrester Creations, that cathedral of fashion, family, and ambition. It had been months since the building had seen true calm. The legacy that had once felt eternal was beginning to tremble beneath the weight of its own name. Forrester was no longer merely a company. It was a battlefield, a living embodiment of betrayal, bloodlines, and beautiful masks hiding dangerous truths. And into this familiar storm stepped Thomas Forrester, older, sharper, and carrying a purpose so precise it frightened even him. His return wasn't announced. It didn't need to be. The energy shifted the moment he entered the lobby, the air heavier, the glances longer. The whispers started first among the junior designers, those who remembered his previous downfall, his obsession, his exile. Then came the silence, the heavy, loaded quiet of those who understood that whenever a Forrester came back, it was never without an agenda. Thomas had changed. His charm was quieter now, more dangerous. The edges of boyish arrogance had been replaced by something colder, discipline mixed with hunger. He wasn't there to rebuild trust. He was there to reclaim what had been taken from him, and perhaps to take what had never been his to begin with. Ridge had once believed his son's redemption was possible. He had tried to convince the board, Brooke, and even Steffi that Thomas deserved another chance. But deep down, Ridge had always known that Thomas was a reflection of himself, ambitious, unpredictable, guided by the wrong things for all the right reasons. And when Thomas returned, he brought more than talent. He brought a secret, one that could dismantle everything Ridge had spent decades building. At first, no one saw the change in him. He moved quietly through the design studio, sketching alone late into the night, speaking softly to the new interns, charming the assistants who remembered the old him with nervous smiles. Paris was the first to notice his precision. "He doesn't just design," she whispered to Zend one afternoon. "He plans. Every sketch feels like it's part of something bigger." Zend didn't disagree. He had his own stake in this, his own desire to rise higher than the family name would allow. For too long, Zend had been treated as the outsider, the adopted Forrester, never quite carrying the same gravity as Ridge's bloodline. So when Thomas began to hint at a new direction for the company, a modern, daring vision that challenged Steffi's leadership, Zend listened. Meanwhile, Steffi was fighting to keep everything from fracturing. She had inherited not only the company's leadership, but also the endless balancing act that came with it, between creativity and control, between loyalty and self-preservation. Her father's shadow loomed large, and every decision she made was compared to Ridge's. She had fought too long, too hard, to let anyone, especially her brother, threaten her position. But Thomas was not playing the same game. He was building an empire inside an empire. His sketches weren't just designs. They were blueprints for a coup. He courted investors discreetly, presented new lines under the guise of collaborative work, and started attending private meetings with people who weren't on Forrester's payroll. Most notably, he began spending time with the Spencers. To the press, it was framed as a reconciliation, Thomas mending fences with Liam and Bill, seeking to repair years of animosity. But those who knew Thomas knew better. The Spencers were sharks, and Thomas had learned to swim among them. Bill Spencer, ever the opportunist, saw something in Thomas he admired, ruthlessness wrapped in elegance. They made an agreement that neither would put in writing. Spencer Publications would provide favorable media coverage for Forrester's new, creative expansion, and in return, Thomas would provide information, leaks about internal disagreements, whispers of mismanagement, enough to make Steffi look unstable in the eyes of the board. At first, it was subtle, minor press leaks about delayed deadlines, financial oversights, creative clashes. But as the tension mounted, the story grew teeth. Steffi Forrester loses control of Forrester Creations, read one article headline on the Spencer fashion blog. Steffi saw it and knew immediately who was behind it. The betrayal didn't surprise her. The timing did. She confronted Thomas one evening after a board meeting. The office was empty except for them, and the hum of the city below sounded like a living heartbeat. You think you can come back here and take what's mine? She demanded, voice trembling not with fear, but rage. Thomas smiled, a quiet, confident smile that made her skin crawl. I'm not taking what's yours, he said. I'm taking what should have been mine all along. This company was built by Dad, by our family, she shot back. And that's exactly the problem, he replied, stepping closer. It's always been Dad's. You've been his favorite toy. Brooke's been his obsession. I'm done living in his echo. I'm not his son anymore. I'm my own man. There it was, the fracture between them finally laid bare. For Steffi, family was sacred. For Thomas, it was a cage. As the weeks passed, Thomas's influence spread. His new line, sleek, architectural, emotionally charged, was unlike anything Forrester had seen before. Critics hailed it as revolutionary. The press called him the future of the brand. Even Ridge, torn between pride and unease, couldn't deny the brilliance of his son's work. But with every success Thomas achieved, Steffi's authority weakened. Brooke, watching all of this unfold, began to see patterns she recognized too well, the dangerous mixture of talent and resentment that had always driven Ridge himself. She warned her husband that Thomas's return would destroy them. He's not here to rebuild, Ridge, she said quietly one night. He's here to take everything. Ridge wanted to believe she was wrong, but even he began to sense it. The secret Thomas carried had something to do with the company's past, something Ridge thought he had buried decades ago. Late one evening, Ridge found Thomas in his office, staring at an old file, one marked Forrester International, 2003. What are you doing with that? Ridge asked, his voice low. Thomas didn't look up. Just studying history, he said. But Ridge knew. Inside that file were records of a scandal that could destroy him, proof that years ago, during the company's financial crisis, Ridge had used insider deals and false claims of intellectual property theft to seize control from Eric. If it ever came to light, everything Ridge had built would crumble. And now Thomas had it. The next morning, a rumor began circulating through the company, whispers that Ridge's position as co-CEO was under review, that new leadership was being considered. When the board convened, Thomas presented his proposal, a vision for the future of Forrester Creations under his creative direction. His tone was measured, his words careful, but his ambition was unmistakable. He framed it as innovation, but everyone in the room could feel the thread humming beneath every sentence. Steffi fought back with the precision of someone who'd been born into war. She reminded the board of Thomas's past, his scandals, his manipulations, his moral lapses. She invoked the brand's reputation, its heritage, its legacy. But Thomas countered every argument with logic, with progress, with charm. Legacy is important, he said. But legacy can also suffocate. We can't keep designing for ghosts. The vote was postponed, but the damage was done. The board was divided. Investors were uncertain. The employees were nervous. And the family, the heart of Forrester Creations, was cracking. Paris found herself caught in the middle. She had admired Thomas once, perhaps still did, but his transformation frightened her. When she confronted him privately, asking why he was doing this, his answer chilled her. Because power, he said softly, is the only thing that makes people listen. As winter settled over Los Angeles, the power struggle intensified. Thomas and Steffi became mirrors of one another, brilliant, relentless, each driven by love twisted into pride. Brooke tried to mediate, but her presence only reignited old wounds. Ridge, torn between them, found himself paralyzed, unable to protect one without betraying the other. And in the midst of it all, the Spencers watched, smiling, as Forrester Creations began to implode from within. The final blow came when Thomas's secret was revealed, not by him, but by fate. An anonymous leak sent copies of Ridge's old documents to the press. The story exploded overnight. Ridge Forrester's hidden betrayal, the real history behind Forrester Creations. Stock prices plummeted, investors fled, and the family name was dragged through the mud. In the aftermath, Thomas stood before his father, the file burning between them. I didn't leak it, he said quietly. But maybe now the truth can finally set us free. Rich looked at him with eyes full of pain. You think this is freedom? You've destroyed everything. Thomas shook his head.
No.
I destroyed the illusion. And perhaps he was right. The empire of Forrester had been built on more than silk and elegance. It had been built on pride, secrecy, and compromise. Thomas hadn't broken it. He had merely exposed its foundation. Steffi, standing in the doorway, watched her brother and father, the two men who had shaped her and scarred her, finally face each other without lies. You wanted to be him, she said to Thomas. But all you've done is become him. Thomas met her gaze, weary but unrepentant. Maybe that's the only way to win in this family, he said. In the end, Forrester Creations survived. It always did, but it was no longer the same. The board restructured. Ridge stepped down temporarily, and Thomas was installed as interim creative director. The victory felt hollow. The family dinners grew quieter. The laughter that once filled the house now echoed against marble and regret. And yet, as the city lights glimmered over the skyline, Thomas stood in his office, staring at the Forrester logo embossed in gold. His reflection stared back, strong, brilliant, and alone. He had won the crown he sought, but the cost was steep. Steffi had stopped speaking to him. Ridge barely looked him in the eye. Brooke, in her quiet fury, had begun working behind the scenes to push him out again. Still, Thomas smiled to himself, a thin, knowing smile. In the end, power wasn't about love or approval. It was about survival. And in the Forrester family, survival was the truest form of art. Outside, the lights of Los Angeles pulsed like stars caught in glass, eternal, glittering, and fragile. Inside Forrester Creations, beneath the perfection of silk and ambition, the family that built beauty from chaos continued to devour itself, one secret, one betrayal, one dream at a time. The night had fallen heavy over Los Angeles, draping Forrester Creations in a veil of silence that felt deceptive, almost sacred. Inside, the corridors gleamed like arteries of glass and ambition, reflecting the dim light of a company that had survived every scandal but never escaped its reflection. Thomas stood alone in his office, his hands resting on the drafting table where his newest collection was spread out, sharp silhouettes, fractured symmetry, fabrics cut as if by precision and pain. The sketches were brilliant, but they looked nothing like peace. They were a war cry stitched in silk. Since his ascent to interim creative director, Thomas had become both the company's savior and its curse. The press praised him as a visionary, a rebel unafraid to disrupt tradition. The board lauded his strategic boldness. But behind the applause lurked unease. His designs were darker, his leadership colder, his energy unpredictable. The younger designers adored him. The veterans feared him. He had turned Forrester Creations into something unrecognizable, more powerful, more dangerous, and infinitely more divided. Steffi could barely look at him. Her pride had always been the armor she wore to survive the business, but now it felt like lead. She had spent her life fighting for this company, defending their name, their legacy, their father. And in a single season, her brother had undone it all. He hadn't just taken her position. He'd rewritten what Forrester meant. When she walked through the hallways now, she saw her father's reflection fading, and in its place, Thomas's shadow growing longer. Brooke, meanwhile, had begun her counterstrike. She had been quiet in the aftermath of Ridge's fall. Too quiet. Behind the scenes, she met with old investors, whispered promises of reform, appealed to nostalgia. She had spent decades watching men destroy the company in the name of pride, and she knew exactly how to rebuild it in the name of survival. She also knew how to destroy Thomas without ever lifting a blade. One afternoon, she appeared in Thomas's office, her entrance as graceful as ever. "You've built quite a kingdom," she said, her voice smooth, but her eyes razor-sharp. Thomas didn't look up from his sketchpad. "A kingdom needs a ruler," he said evenly. "And we both know Dad isn't that anymore." Brooke stepped closer, the faint scent of her perfume cutting through the sterile air. "You think this is power, Thomas?" Running a company built on ashes? Your father's name still hangs above that door, and the world still sees his legacy, not yours. You've inherited a crown, but you're wearing it in a graveyard. He finally looked at her then, eyes dark, calm, dangerous. You've spent your whole life building crowns for men you could control, he said. But I'm not one of them. You can't seduce, manipulate, or mother me into submission. This time, Brooke, you're the one who'll be watching from the sidelines. The exchange sent tremors through the halls. Brooke's subtle war against Thomas had begun. Whispers of corporate misconduct, questions about his alliance with the Spencers, rumors of creative theft. And as if on cue, the Spencer empire itself began to fracture. Bill Spencer had never cared for loyalty, only leverage. When he saw that Thomas's newfound power made Forrester Creations vulnerable, he began plotting the inevitable takeover. He sent his sons, Liam and Wyatt, to reconnect with the Forresters, to charm and probe, to find the company's next weak point. Liam, once again drawn to Hope's orbit, found himself torn between guilt and curiosity. He didn't trust Thomas, he never had, but he also couldn't deny the allure of the chaos Thomas created. It made Hope's world unstable, and in instability, Liam always found his way back to her. Hope, now part of Thomas's design team, had become both his muse and his undoing. Their old chemistry still burned beneath the surface, fragile but alive. She admired his talent, his drive, his darkness. The things that made him dangerous were the same things that made her feel seen. But the line between admiration and addiction was thin. Late one evening, Hope found Thomas alone in the design studio, working under the soft glow of desk lamps. "You should sleep," she said softly, though her voice betrayed the longing she'd tried to suppress. He didn't turn. "Sleep is for people who don't have something to prove." "You've already proved it," she said. "Everyone sees what you've done." He looked up then, his eyes catching hers in a way that froze her. "Not everyone," he said. "Not the people who matter." There was a moment, silent, electric, fragile, where the air between them felt alive. Hope stepped closer, the words trembling on her lips. "Thomas," but before she could finish, Steffi appeared in the doorway, her voice slicing through the air like a knife. "Careful, Hope," she said. "We both know what happens when you mistake obsession for inspiration." The tension that followed was unbearable. Hope flushed, retreating, while Thomas met his sister's gaze with defiance. "You don't get to question me anymore," he said. "And you don't get to destroy everything Dad built," she snapped. "Not again." He stood, his voice low, steady. "I'm not destroying it, Steffi. I'm replacing it." That night, Steffi made her decision. She called Zend and Paris, both of whom had begun to chafe under Thomas's rule, and began building a counter-alliance. Together, they would challenge his control from within, a quiet rebellion under the guise of loyalty. Their plan was simple: expose Thomas's alliance with the Spencers, force a board review, and reinstate Ridge before the company collapsed entirely. But Thomas, ever the strategist, anticipated it. He had spent years studying his family's patterns, learning how they operated. He knew betrayal always came disguised as righteousness. When the board meeting finally arrived, he revealed his own trump card, a new partnership with an international fashion conglomerate that would double Forrester Creations' global presence. The deal, of course, had one condition: that Thomas remain creative director indefinitely. It was a masterstroke. The board, swayed by profit, voted in his favor. Steffi's rebellion collapsed before it began. After the meeting, Ridge approached his son, pride and disappointment warring in his eyes. "You won," he said. "But I don't even recognize you anymore." Thomas looked at him, emotion flickering briefly across his face before vanishing. "That's because you never really saw me, Dad. You saw what you wanted me to be." Ridge's voice softened. "I saw my son." Thomas shook his head. "No. You saw your rival." As Ridge walked away, his reflection faded into the mirrored glass. 2 generations of Forrester men divided not by failure, but by success. But the higher Thomas climbed, the lonelier he became. His alliance with Bill began to rot from the inside. Bill had no loyalty to anyone but himself, and when the first cracks in Thomas's leadership appeared, he pounced. A leaked story hit the fashion world like a bombshell. Thomas Forrester's designs under investigation for copyright infringement. The claim was false, of course, orchestrated by Bill to destabilize him, but the damage was immediate. Investors panicked. Orders were canceled. The press feasted. Steffi, watching the chaos unfold, felt a strange mix of pity and vindication. "You wanted to be king," she murmured. "Now you'll learn what it means to be alone on the throne." Hope tried to reach him, but he shut her out completely. Nights passed where he didn't leave the office, his hands stained with charcoal and frustration, his mind spiraling between genius and madness. He began to see patterns in everything, betrayal in every kindness, lies in every compliment. The brilliance that had once elevated him now devoured him. When Rich finally returned to the company, it wasn't as a conqueror, but as a father. He found Thomas asleep at his desk, surrounded by torn sketches. Quietly, Ridge covered him with a jacket, the same one Thomas had worn as a child when he first began drawing designs on napkins. "You're not your mistakes," Ridge whispered, though he wasn't sure if he believed it. In the weeks that followed, the family began to rebuild again. Brooke's machinations softened into pity. Steffi, though still wary, offered Thomas a truce. "We don't have to be enemies," she said. "We just can't keep being each other's wounds." Thomas looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "Maybe," he said, "the only way to fix what's broken is to stop pretending we're still a family." The words hurt, but they were true. Forrester Creations would go on, it always did, but the Forresters themselves had become something else entirely. Not a family. Not a company. Something in between. A dynasty of survivors trapped inside the glittering machinery of their own ambition. And somewhere deep inside Thomas, beneath the exhaustion and the guilt, something darker began to stir. The quiet, familiar whisper of a man who had seen too much to ever believe in peace again. Because in Los Angeles, nothing beautiful ever stayed unbroken for long.